Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Why did he say on Breakfast TV on Monday the 21st of March that people earning between $40,000 and $70,000 a year were, quote unquote, really struggling?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, because some of them are, and actually probably some of them have for a very long time, notwithstanding that in the 2 years that National's been in office, someone earning $48,000 a year has received a tax cut of $64 per week. And that's because people in that category often have children. They face a significant number of costs, and some of them are unexpected costs like higher petrol prices.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, are they really struggling because his government, contrary to its promise, put GST up on almost everything those families had to buy, including high-priced goods like milk and petrol?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, quite the contrary, actually. They received a reasonable tax cut, and as I say, someone earning $48,000 a year received a tax cut of $64 since this government's been in office. And as I've said so often, if the Leader of the Opposition doesn't agree with the policy, he should just go and reverse it.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker,
Order.
Are middle-income people really struggling? Because actually the tax cut that he gave to somebody on $40,000 a year is about $22 a week, while he gave himself and his mates on the same income $1,000 a week.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I don't get $1,000 a week as a tax cut. But Mr Speaker, the point I would make is he's just answered his own earlier question. They're getting $22 a week more.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, is the couple with 2 children in early childhood education who are now paying $50 a week more because of the cuts his government imposed really struggling, because that $50 a week more is more than they got for that one thing alone than their entire tax cuts?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I can't say that there isn't a New Zealander that's paying $50 a week more, but I will say this: I'll be surprised if there's too many, because I fondly remember a question in the House about a month ago where the Labor member went through all of the increases and listed people at $14 to $18. Couldn't come up with one solid name at $50.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
There are a whole lot of families that are, to use his term, really struggling, because with unemployment going up by an extra 700 Kiwis a week, many families that used to be able to meet their rent or their mortgage with 2 incomes are now forced to do it on just one.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, that's always possible if someone loses their job, that the family might have to survive on one income, not 2. But I would point out, if we want to talk about mortgages, that the average floating rate at the moment is 5.7% in New Zealand. It was 10.9% the year Labor left office. A family with an average mortgage of $200,000 would be paying $200 a week less under National than Labor.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Are those families really struggling because their incomes haven't gone up? Because under his government in the last 6 months of 2010, New Zealand had one of the worst rates of growth of any developed country in the world.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no. That is not the case. And if one looks at real after-tax wages, they have grown by about 9% under this government in 2 years in office. They grew 3% in the entire 9 years of Labor. And if the member is interested, I'm happy to point out to him exactly what the increase has been. Someone on the average wage in after-tax terms in the time the government's been in office has seen their income rise from $39,518 to $42,214 years for $214. Last year alone, that was a rise of 6.8%.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, if any of that were true, why is it that the rate of immigration of New Zealanders to Australia last year was the second highest in 10 years?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, well, it is true, and if the member doesn't believe it's true, he's quite welcome to take a breach of privilege claim. I can assure you he won't be this afternoon. And Mr Speaker, if the member wants to talk about people leaving for Australia, he should look at the entire time he was in government.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, if the Prime Minister thinks...
is this a point of order?
No, this is a question, Mr Speaker. If the Prime Minister thinks that somebody on $40,000 a year is really struggling, How does he think the person on the minimum wage, $27,000 a year, is getting on when his government gave that person a miserable 25 cents an hour in face of the highest level of inflation in 20 years?
The Right Honourable Prime
Speaker,
Minister.
well, if the member thinks 25 cents an hour is miserable, then why is he promising all New Zealanders a $10 tax cut, which equates to exactly the same number?
Question. Order. Now, we will have some order. The member has been waiting till the microphone's been open and interjecting quite extensively today. It's not good enough. Dr. Russell Norman, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My supplementary to the Prime Minister. Does he agree with the Minister of Finance statement from the 1st of February that borrowing an additional $5 billion would almost certainly lead to a credit ratings downgrade for New Zealand, pushing up interest rates for Kiwi families and businesses and costing jobs? And if so, why, in his response to the Christchurch rebuild, is he proposing to do exactly that, borrow additional $5 billion rather than strike a temporary levy?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I do agree with the Minister of Finance, and the reason is because the government's decided that the most effective way of paying for that short-term build-up in debt is to try and trim its expenditure. That way, we can cut out some expenditure which we think is not as optimal today as it was back when it was first introduced, as opposed to sending New Zealanders a bill. And under the policy being promoted by the Green Party, he would be sending New Zealanders a bill for the earthquake.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he agree that if he proceeds to borrow $5 billion to pay for the rebuild, that the bill for the New Zealand government in interest alone will be around $250 million a year, not even paying off any of the capital, and a much more fiscally responsible approach would be a small temporary earthquake levy?
The Right Honourable
Mr.
Prime
Speaker,
Minister.
no and no, because the government will be trimming its expenditure and therefore paying off its debt.
Supplementary.
Dr. Russell Norman.
My question to the Prime Minister is, does he believe that savage cuts in government spending will have a negative impact on the New Zealand economy?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't describe the proposal the government is reviewing at the moment as savage cuts. The government will in fact actually spend more money next year. It may like to get to a point where it may like to get to its point. I'm sorry you don't understand the economics. I know Labor's struggling to come up with a finance spokesman, but the reality is that your discretionary spend might be zero, but actually there'll be more older people in New Zealand next year getting superannuation, and there'll be more people taking other benefits from the government. So no, I don't agree with that proposition.
Question number 3.